Welcome back. At the conclusion of our last session, Job's three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, have just arrived to support him. When these friends are introduced at the end of chapter 2, we can read that they wept for Job and sat down with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his grief was very great. By this time in the story, Job has already lost his children, his property, and his health was suffering due to the boils he was struck with earlier in chapter 2. It was good that Job's three friends had heard of his strife and wanted to come and mourn with him and comfort him. However, soon Job's friends started arguing with Job that suffering is punishment for sin and that prosperity is the reward for righteousness. They tried to convince Job that his suffering might be punishment from God as the result of some great sin that he committed. Job defends himself against his friends' opinions and expresses that there is evidence all over the world that the wicked often prosper and that the righteous often suffer. He makes his case to his friends that he hadn't committed any horrendous sin that would have set him up for the suffering above others. As we progress through the book of Job, his friends' speeches start getting repetitive and shorter. By chapter 26, Job is the only one speaking. He has been able to argue that suffering cannot be explained by the simple principle of punishment and justice, where each person gets what he or she deserves. The bad people suffer, and the good people prosper. However, he is still without an answer as to why he is suffering. By the end of chapter 31, Job has painted a picture of an unpredictable God. Job believes that God rules the affairs of men and does so wisely, but all seems to be random and arbitrary according to man's view. Job still doesn't have an answer for why the righteous suffer. The very first verse of chapter 32 reads, "So these three men ceased answering Job, because he was righteous in his own eyes." However, not everyone is content to let Job remain in his own thinking. Among the group of men who are with Job is a young man named Elihu, who has remained quiet to this point out of respect to his elders. In verses 6 through 10, Elihu acknowledges his youth and implores Job and his friends to listen to him. Elihu brings an entirely new perspective to the situation, explaining that the suffering of the righteous is not a demonstration of God's hatred, but rather of his love. It is not a punishment of their sins, but rather a refinement of their righteousness. Over the next 6 chapters, Elihu contradicts Job and his friends. First, Elihu says Job's friends are wrong in saying that suffering is the proof of wickedness, which has been their only explanation for Job's suffering. Also in these 6 chapters, Elihu shows why Job is wrong in his understanding of the suffering too. Job's understanding of God's justice was the same as his 3 friends. However, because Job insisted that he was righteous, he could not make his suffering fit with the justice of God. Elihu sees the pride and arrogance in some of what Job has said and points it out to him. In chapter 33, verses 8 through 12, Elihu addresses Job. "Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words, saying, 'I am pure, without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no iniquity in me.' Yet he finds occasions against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths. Look, in this you are not righteous. I will answer you, for God is greater than man." Elihu explains that even though Job is a righteous man, he is not sinless and perfect. He points out that there are specks of pride that have begun to cloud the purity of Job's life once it was stirred up by his suffering. Elihu ultimately concludes that affliction makes a righteous person sensitive to his remaining sinfulness, and that God uses suffering to further refine those he loves. In chapter 36, verse 10, Elihu states that God also opens their ear to instruction and commands that they turn from iniquity. This is reaffirmed by the psalmist in Psalm 119:71. "It was good for me that I have been afflicted, that I may learn your statutes." What this shows us is that there are some dimensions of God's love that the righteous can only learn through affliction and suffering. For example, even though we have heard from a young age that God loves us, it may be only in our toughest moments of despair and rejection that we become aware of His loving arms around us and experience the way He tenderly carries us through. It is fire that drives the impurities out of gold. It is the heat and pressure of the bowels of the earth that make diamonds. And often it is intense situations in our lives that bring to the surface impurities in our natures that need to be addressed. Can we find God's love in a challenging neighbor or co-worker who brings out in us our impatience? Or in a diagnosis that challenges us to trust Him? The author of Hebrews encourages his readers in a similar way, reminding them in chapter 12 of the New International Version, starting in verse 6, that the Lord disciplines the one He loves, and He chastens everyone He accepts as His son. Continuing in verse 10, God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in His holiness. Elihu wants Job to see that permitting his suffering does fit with the nature of God, because it is an act of love. Job does not argue with Elihu. In fact, he doesn't have the chance to say anything at all, because it is at this point that God finally breaks his silence. Join us in the final 2 sessions as we explore the importance of Job's open communication with God and the final resolution that God provides.